My name is Ian Hunter. I'm a principal at Academy Global. I'm an experienced senior executive from the public service, and I now work with the private sector and the public sector to make sure that the understanding between the private sector and the public sector is enhanced. We're currently dealing with a lot of complexity in the public sector. Being in government is more complex than it has ever been in the past. The relationship between the private sector and the public sector also is now more complex than it's been in the past. That simple relationship that the government set the regulations or the rules and the private sector complied with those, it's now way more challenging for the private sector to make sure that they can operate commercially in the modern era. So government is more complex, so therefore the private sector has to have a deeper understanding of how government operates. There are risks and opportunities for the private sector in dealing with government. There are opportunities because the government is now looking to the private sector to deliver what it traditionally delivered, both in terms of goods, services to the community, to those people in need. They're also looking to the private sector for leadership, for innovation, for ideas. Governments are absolutely committed to economic growth, but they're also absolutely committed to delivering public good for their citizens. The other thing that the private sector has to bear in mind is that regulatory risk is increasing. The reasons why government makes decisions are more complex and more subject to influence than they have ever been. So that creates uncertainty. So the private sector needs to understand why the government makes the decisions that it might make. Well, the private sector or commercial people need to understand how government makes decisions because lots of government decisions, if not all government decisions, have an impact on their operations. So the goal for commercial entities is to both understand but also, ideally, influence how those decisions are made. Now that might sound a bit pejorative, but influence doesn't necessarily mean anything underhand. Governments like to make decisions on the best information that they can access, and their sources of information are varied. They'll come from the public, from within government, from the public sector, but also from the commercial sector. Government needs to understand how the commercial sector is operating, and they want to understand how the commercial sector is operating. It's very complex, the process of decision making in government. There's the formal process. Who makes the decision? Is it Parliament or a minister? Or has the minister delegated decision to the public sector? But there's also the informal factors that influence how governments make decisions. The political realities within which governments operate. What does the community think about an issue? Are they concerned about it? Does the commercial entity have the social license to operate? Do they have a good reputation? Compliance for the private sector or commercial entity is not enough anymore. You have to have a social license to operate. That means that you have to have really good community engagement, good customer engagement, and you have to have a good understanding of government, but also a good level of engagement with government. So government doesn't like risk. Generally speaking, a bit like the private sector, but for different reasons. Commercial entities don't like commercial risk. They try to manage that risk or mitigate that risk. In the same way, governments seek to mitigate risk, but the causes of risk are different. They might be commercial, but they're also political. And that can change very quickly. We're now dealing in an environment, thanks to social media, where people can form a view based on imperfect information and be extremely influential. And we've seen some sectors where that's played out. We're all familiar with how the resources sector and the energy sector have had to deal with a highly volatile political environment. That creates commercial risk. Do we invest? Do we wait for government to firm up its position? What's our position? How do we understand risk? How do we understand government? So those are some of the critical factors that the commercial sector needs to take into account. I think the commercial sector needs to understand those factors that influence decisions. They need to put themselves in the shoes of the decision maker. They first need to understand who that decision maker is. Is it a politician? Is it a cabinet? Is it the parliament? Or is it a senior public servant? It can even be a public servant who doesn't appear to be that senior to the commercial sector if they're making a decision that's delegated under statute. So the critical factor for the commercial sector is how to understand those decisions. In order to do that, the commercial sector needs to understand both processes, what's the legislative regime that dictates the framework within which decisions are made, but also processes that inform decisions. And then finally, they need to understand those factors of influence. Are there critical stakeholders that might support the interests of the commercial sector or possibly impede the commercial interests of a commercial entity? So we've seen lots of examples where community groups, for example, have been able to form a really powerful lobby because they've been concerned, for example, about the environmental impact or the impact on the built environment from a development. So even though the economics might stack up, and even though it appears to be commercially viable, sometimes those factors which appear irrational to the commercial sector can have a really strong influence. In this day and age of social media where information can be shared so quickly, it's quite easy for stakeholders and lobby groups to promulgate their position to a wide audience. The commercial sector needs to be wary of that, but also needs to take advantage of it, because the commercial sector needs to think about the external community and those stakeholders, not necessarily as resistors or opponents, but people that they can work with. Governments like to see the commercial sector have that social license to operate. The commercial entity that has a good relationship with its customers and a good relationship with its consumers or its community has a strong base on which to engage with government. Well, the commercial sector can engage with government fundamentally through two ways. They can have the internal skills, they can have those in-house skills. They can employ people who understand government, and that will help them engage with government. Some large entities have easier access to government because of their standing in the community and because of their significant contribution to economic growth. So large major corporates have that capacity. Commercial entities might also use industry associations to engage with government. And industry associations often hire people who have worked in government, or at least who understand how government works. For example, former political advisors or senior public servants. The other way that commercial entities can engage with government is by seeking third-party skills. And they can do that through hiring lobbyists or government relation firms or consulting firms to help them engage with government. And those services are provided in lots of different ways. Sometimes they just help a commercial entity gain access. The more important firms help to explain an issue to the commercial entity and help to translate their needs to the government. And then they can operate as that interface between government and the commercial entity. What I'm really interested in is how we make sure the skills that are within the private sector can be enhanced. Even if you still want to engage third-party services to help you engage with government, it really helps that you understand government so you know which skills you need and when you need them. I've seen plenty of examples where the private sector has engaged those skills when they really don't need to do it. For example, do you really need to pay someone to arrange a meeting with a minister? Why not just engage the minister's office yourself? You'll almost certainly get that meeting. Do you really have to understand how the minister thinks about issues or who works in his office for you to engage with government? That might help, but it's much more important that you understand how the minister or his delegate or her delegate might make decisions. So those are choices that the private sector needs to make. It obviously helps them from a commercial perspective if they make those decisions from an informed basis. The better they understand government, the more they'll be able to effectively engage with government and determine how to do that. Because of that extent of interface between government and the private sector, government has lots of policies which safeguard both the public interest but also the private interest. So, for example, the government has very strict rules about how it procures goods and services from the private sector. This is critical. There's obviously potential for corruption, there's obviously potential for conflict of interest, and there's obviously potential for maladministration, simply poor decisions being made. So the government has lots of policies to ensure that when it procures services or when it procures goods, it can justify the procurement. So that's why it has a very rigorous set of policies and also very strong oversight bodies. Secretaries of clusters have strong accountabilities to those oversight bodies, and they must justify all of the decisions that they make, as do ministers. It's normal for clusters to have audit and risk committees. It's normal for large clusters to be subject to independent audit. The Auditor General will look at processes by which a government or agency or a minister, usually an agency, will procure services or goods. There are lots of oversight bodies protecting the private sector's interests. Generally speaking, the public sector is always seeking value for money, but they're also seeking the best possible outcome. On both counts, they're accountable to the public. So it's not just those oversight bodies. The media has a high level of scrutiny directed towards government decisions. So a government is always exposing itself. The decisions are open to judgment. A poor decision will be scrutinised, and it's not surprising when a poor decision becomes visible to the community, and that creates risk for the public sector. So it's those risks that the public sector is trying to mitigate. Partly that's self-interest, but more importantly, it's to protect the public interest. Let me give you an example. If a large public sector organisation was commissioning services in the social welfare space, for example, to provide services to the disability community, of course, they want those services to be provided efficiently, but also effectively. They will have very strong policies around procurement, but they'll have very strong policies around contracting and the terms within contracts, which ensure that the outputs and the outcomes that they're seeking to deliver are in fact delivered. And if they're not, that they can have some form of redress. Incredibly important when ministers are accountable to the Parliament on the expenditure of their budgets. So governments obviously commit to key policies, and they communicate those policies to the public. So they're accessible, but policies change, and they change for a number of reasons. That creates risk for the commercial sector. So for example, in the energy space or the resources space, we've seen a lot of volatility in government policies, and that's been driven by community concerns around climate change, local impacts of resource extraction, overseas influence, job security. So how does the commercial sector deal with this volatility? Well, mainly through engagement. The commercial sector needs to understand why, but also the prospect of policy change occurring. That will give some security and some confidence for the commercial sector as they seek to exploit opportunities that result from government policy setting.